Well, we've got a polarised news today because two key issues we think are extremely important: events in Ukraine and also what is happening with the health of the nation here in UK. But let's kick off with Ukraine. And first of all, we want to take our viewers back to 2017, when in a very muddy global pond, a UK column was starting to warn about events that we were seeing, and we wish to take our viewers and listeners back to have a look at what was happening there, because it has a really interesting impact on what we're seeing in Ukraine now. And of course, Mike, you picked up on this. This was the EU Eastern Partnership. So we've got a little video playing on screen if you're just listening into the UK column today, taking place in Brussels with leaders from Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, and of course, Ukraine. And they're going to be meeting their 28 counterparts at the very heart of the EU. And then this video clip takes us through some of the things they're going to be doing, celebrating more mobility, more market access, more business, more connections, more security. That's an interesting one, because what did that actually mean at the time? And they're going to be looking ahead to define new joint projects, more climate action, more student exchanges, more access to finance, more digital transformation, more reforms, and finally, the key bit, empowering the young generations, and that'll be a focus of the leaders' discussions. So how do you feel about that, seeing that again now, Mike?
Well, future leadership, all about building new relationships as part of the expansion eastwards, of course, is putting pressure on Russia.
Indeed. And of course, targeting in particular the youth, the student exchanges. This is all about breaking down the barriers of the nation state. So it was very clear that the EU was heavily targeting the eastern states. And of course, the meetings followed. This is just one of many publicity pictures. So we've got Georgia meeting with the Ukrainian president, and that's all looking rather wonderful. But UK column was quickly warning what was coming. And this was BBC News reporting that Theresa May was warning of a hostile Russia threat to EU security. And in our turn, we said that basically what was going to happen was that Theresa May was launching Operation Barbarossa, the name for the Nazi attack on Russia at the start of the Second World War. And of course, it was the West that had an eye on Eastern European grain, oil and technology. Now, that was not going back to World War II. We're talking about Theresa May and the Conservatives here. And we commented that the British Conservative Prime Minister was risking lives of millions of young Poles and Germans in her drive to war in Eastern Europe. Many poor people thought this was strong language at the time, but we were pretty convinced there was something nasty coming. And you commented here, Mike, from agriculture in Ukraine to the tech sector in Belarus, there is a huge amount of potential in the eastern neighbourhood that we should nurture and develop. This is, of course, a direct quote from Theresa May. But we must also be open-eyed to the actions of hostile states like Russia, which threaten this potential and attempt to tear our collective strength apart. So a lot of concern there that the Russians clearly not happy with what was happening and they were going to react. The UK may be leaving the EU, but we're not leaving Europe, and we're unconditionally committed to maintaining Europe's security. And then it moved on, because here we've got the Telegraph, Britain to launch counter-propaganda war against Russia as Theresa May unveils the Fusion Doctrine defence plan. And we labelled this, helped with the BBC, the biggest propaganda machine the world has ever seen. Theresa May unleashes a Barbarossa campaign against Russia with a propaganda war. So that had moved from 2017 into 2018. And if we jump forward to 2023, obviously on Monday, we were reporting Tobias Ellwood here crowing that the UK could use nudging in order to get other leaders, Western leaders, even the US, to devote more to the war in Ukraine. We had Ben Wallace, who was getting very excited that tens of thousands of young men could die. He seemed to be quite happy that was going to be Russians, but of course the reality is that it's mainly Ukrainians. And then he's complaining that you can't magic up tanks and weapon systems that they need. I just have to insert this little one, because if you have a look at what Ben Wallace is up to, has been up to over the last day, he's glad-handing the veterans at the D-Day celebrations over in France. And I just find this so cynical. If only those men knew what was really being cooked up by Ben Wallace's government. And Mike, you picked out here Tobias Ellwood, of course, crowing that we want more tanks, missiles and F-16s, a roadmap into NATO for Ukraine, and an improved grain deal.
Well, exactly. His main focus is on the grain. So this narrative has been running for 5 or 6 years now, and people haven't been aware that it's been coming.
No. So what we're trying to do today is bring this together so that people can see how this plan has unfolded. If we continue with Tobias, of course, we also commented on Monday that he was saying that basically because UK was taking the lead and stepping forward, it encouraged others to then follow suit. And this is the UK government using its applied psychology on international partners to draw them deeper into the NATO proxy war against Russia. And you've got some more here, Michael.
Well, yes, because it's a new article from Yahoo News. The mainstream's starting to recognise who has actually been pushing the hardest to maintain this war effort in Ukraine, and of course it is the UK. So this headline here, how the UK helped convince the US and its allies to spend big to help Ukraine in its war with Russia. And just highlight a couple of quotes from this. Months before Russia launched its invasion on February the 24th, the UK began flying plane loads of shoulder-launched anti-tank missile launchers, the Anglo-Swedish NLAW, to Ukraine at a time when doing so was highly controversial in Europe. The prevailing assumption on the continent was that Russia would overrun Kiev in days. And they went on to say, London's bullishness, US and UK officials say, has had a galvanizing effect on Western security alliance in general. Speaking on condition of anonymity, a senior US diplomat told Yahoo News that the provision of Storm Shadows even helped break the White House's impasse on sending F-16 fighters. Now, the point here is that if we look back over the last number of years and we look at Syria, for example, the UK has led the way all the way. So, for example, if we look at it from the other side of the coin, when the UK decided not to bomb Ukraine in 2013, the United States decided that it wouldn't either because the UK had made that decision already, so they were prepared to go it alone. We move forward to Ukraine. The UK is pushing the hardest to make sure that this war continues, and all the other little vassal states who, on the face of it, seem to be superior, but from a sort of political or a geopolitical position aren't really, because the UK is setting the policy and everybody's following.
Yeah. So F-16s there. Let's bring in a bit more on that. And of course, we've gone to the Kiev Independent here because they've got a couple of really interesting articles to do with jets. So the headline here, Zelensky, Ukraine to receive significant number of F-16 fighter jets. And if we just take a little bit of the text out, it says here that Zelensky said during a press conference that Ukraine will receive a significant number of F-16 fighter jets based on discussions with European partners. And this is being reported by Suspilny. Now, let's just remember that the moment we look at Suspilny, this is a BBC media construct. So this is effectively a vassal of the BBC. You're not dealing with a clean Ukrainian report here because the BBC is holding the hands of Suspilny in the background to make sure they say the right thing. But we can add from the article, the president added that the deal still requires consent from the US, which manufactures F-16s, and no details or specifics are currently being disclosed. So the F-16s dangled in front of of Ukraine. They're actually not going to change the course of the war, but of course Zelensky and the Ukrainian military getting very excited. Will the US say yes or no? Well, probably it's going to take the UK to convince the Americans to say yes. But then we've got another article from the Kiev Independent. Media Australia considers sending its F-18 fighter jets to Ukraine. Now, the Australians getting rid of these aircraft. A transfer would require permission from the US, so everything comes back to the US again, as it owns the intellectual property. But according to the report, Washington is favourably disposed to the idea. But actually, these aircraft are much like the debate we've seen with the tanks, because it goes on to say the bulk of the planes would take little work to be brought up to flying conditions, while others can be cannibalized for scrap parts. So these are not aircraft in the prime of their life. They're aircraft that have not been flying. They're going to take work to be brought up to flying condition. But let's throw them on to the Ukrainians as a little sop to keep the Ukrainians fighting and dying in this proxy war.
Well, it's a gift that keeps on giving.
Absolutely,
because otherwise we would have to spend millions of pounds decommissioning, scrapping, dealing with the scrap metal, and instead we're just going to spread it around the landscape of Ukraine. It's fantastic.
Meanwhile, the defence industry, of course, gets the orders in for the replacement aircraft. Well, on the theme of the West, moving on to cause trouble, this is originally a Financial Times article. The headline was "Serbia backs ammunition shipments to Ukraine in westward pivot," but it was taken up by Russia Today. And I'm using their dialogue here, but essentially what they're saying is that the West has begun criticizing Kosovo Albanians because Serbia agreed to look the other way as its ammunition is delivered to Ukraine. So what a remarkable coincidence that we've got this trouble, pretty vicious rioting and rebellion around Kosovo. But in the background, what can we see? The objective is to get more ammunition into Ukraine for more Ukrainians to die in the proxy war. And if we come on to the subject of tanks, it's pretty clear that that's not all going well. A little video clip here with a bit of comment on the American Abrams tank. Let's listen to what this man says.
The M1 Abrams tank is one of the most powerful ground weapons in the U.S. arsenal. Equipped with a 1,500 horsepower turbine engine and a top speed of more than 40 miles per hour. It comes with a 120mm cannon, 3 machine guns, and armor that can withstand frontal hits from enemy tanks with minimal damage. And these tanks could help Ukrainian forces take back Russian-occupied territories. But Pentagon officials have expressed concerns that these tanks could pose major logistical issues for Ukraine.
The Abrams requires a lot of support, and if the Ukrainians don't have everything that it takes to operate the Abrams, they might end up being more of a detriment than they are a help.
So a pretty black and white statement. We're going to offer you tanks. They're not really suitable for you. If you take them on, they can cause more problems than they're worth. So the Ukrainians being deceived here again by the West. And it's a little bit ironic that the Kiev Independent got quite hostile in an email exchange with the UK column because we were essentially warning them that Ukraine was going to be deceived and undermined by the West. So it's now becoming apparent with the aircraft, with the tanks, with the lack of munitions. Ukraine is simply being asked to carry on and fight the offensive, but the West is not providing and cannot provide the arms that Ukraine needs. Let's have a look at this Financial Times clip, which of course is promoting the idea of a Ukrainian offensive.
For Ukraine and for the West,
The pressure's building.
this is now the comeback.
Expect news of the Ukrainians conducting a host of attacks.
As Ukraine's long-awaited counter-offensive appears to have finally begun, what does Ukraine want to achieve? The Economist's Russia and Eastern European editor, Arkady Ostrovsky, gives his 3 key takeaways.
President Zelensky has spoken that the full territorial integrity of Ukraine needs to be restored. That does mean moving all the way to the borders of 1991. In practice, I think there is a realization that Ukrainian army can possibly take quite a lot of territory to, at the very least, to break the land bridge that connects Azov and the Black Sea and possibly get to the borders of Crimea. One of the key things, of course, is for Ukraine to be able to liberate and hold that territory, preventing any counteroffensive from Russia.
Well, you were smiling as that piece was rolling on, Mike. And of course, it's quite ridiculous for the Financial Times to suggest that Ukraine is in this position, because as we're going to see, they have been fighting all along the front over the last few days. But of course, Western media not covering the conflict because the Ukrainians have been doing extremely badly. Now, we've gone to the Russians for this report. Make no apology for that, because consistently in the war, the Russian reports have been more accurate than those coming out of Ukraine. And in any case, Ukraine is not reporting casualties. But here's a statement by the Russian Minister of Defense, Shoigu. And let's have a look at the key paragraph here. On 4th of June, 23rd and 31st Mechanized Brigades of the AFU attempting an offensive. The enemy did not succeed. 300 servicemen, 16 tanks, 26 armoured fighting vehicles and 14 motor vehicles were destroyed. It goes on to talk about the 5th of June with even more losses, 1,600 troops, 28 tanks, including 8 Leopard tanks, 3 French AMX-10 wheeled tanks, 136 other military vehicles, including 79 foreign manufactured one. And the video footage coming from the battle, which is, of course, widely available on social media, absolutely supports this level of losses as the Ukrainians came out from hiding into the open fields and were caught by anti-tank weapons. But the report continued. We'll just do a little bit more. All in all, during 3 days of fighting in all directions, the losses of the AFU amounted to 3,715 troops, 52 tanks, 207 armoured fighting vehicles, 134 motor vehicles, 5 aircraft, 2 helicopters, 48 pieces of field artillery, and 53 unmanned aerial vehicles. None of this, of course, being reported by the West. And if we sum up the battlefield at the moment, it's pretty appalling. So the counterattacks by Ukraine have failed with high casualties. The Russians have held with very few casualties. War dead for Ukraine, around 300,000, but this is widely regarded as a low estimate. 50,000 for the Russians, regarded as a high estimate. Ukraine left with 300,000 perhaps operational troops, some reserves, but limited quality as the professionals have been killed. Meanwhile, Russia is ramping up for 1.2 million men, but 400,000 experienced troops. Ukraine, 90% of the air force destroyed. Russia, 100% operating. They have lost aircraft, but those have been replaced. Ukraine, probably 30% of armoured vehicles left, but this is now a mix of Western obsolete equipment. Russians are at 100% strength on armoured vehicles with thousands in reserve. Air defences, Ukraine down to 5, possibly 10% operational, and the recent US Patriots destroyed and damaged. The Russians, meanwhile, have a comprehensive air defence. Ammunition for Ukraine is in a very short supply. For the Russians, it is abundant. Guided weapons on the Ukraine side are in short supply, but even the Western equipment, such as JDAMs and Storm Shadow from the UK, those Storm Shadow long-range missiles, are not effective because they're being interfered with by the Russians. Meanwhile, the Russians have abundant guided weapons, and some of those are clearly world-beating in their abilities. Electronic warfare, insignificant on the Ukrainian side, but for the Russians, described by an American general during the Syria crisis as eye-watering. Ukrainian economy fully destroyed, whereas, of course, the Russian economy, despite the sanctions, continues to operate. So this is the pitiful background. More Ukrainian dead in a proxy war for the US, UK, NATO and the EU to achieve its aims.
And in the meantime, James Cleverly, a couple of days ago, was in Kiev to keep the war going. Here he is with Zelensky. So he was there on Monday. Ukraine can count on our support, he said on Twitter, for as long as it takes. Thank you to President Zelensky and Dmytro Kuleba for welcoming me to Kiev. So this is the fourth meeting between Zelensky and senior UK ministers in the last few weeks. So then the following day, so I'll just give a quote first. He said, and this just is really insane. So anyway, he said, forcibly deporting children. What he means is that the Russians have removed children from the war zone. And if they want to call that forcibly deporting children, that's fine. But it seems to me it's more about taking them out of to a place of safety. But anyway, razing cities like Bakhmut, Izium, and Mariupol to the ground and committing atrocities are not the acts of responsible international state. They're the actions of a hostile regime that is in violation of the UN Charter. So he's saying that Russia has razed Mariupol to the ground. Well, let's just have a look at one example of sheer propaganda that backs that up from Sky News. Mariupol, Russia's new model city in Ukraine. And let's look at some of the text here. A city destroyed. Mariupol has been turned to rubble twice, first by Russian missiles, then by Russian bulldozers. So the fact that there's been a war and a conflict and that Russia is knocking down buildings that have been damaged or destroyed in that war and is then rebuilding them, that's something to be vilified by the Western press.
Of course, but this particular report makes me smile because here we are in Plymouth, the UK column based in Plymouth. Plymouth badly bombed by the Germans during the Second World War. And what happened at the end of the war, the city was rebuilt under the Abercrombie plan, which involved the local city council demolishing more buildings that the Luftwaffe had demolished. So if we want a perfect example of the same thing taking place in UK, Plymouth is the place to look at.
So bringing that back on for a second, now a model city is emerging. So Sky does recognise that Russia is rebuilding Mariupol, so regeneration happening. But anyway, coming back to Cleverly for a second, he's talking about how we're going to reconstruct Ukraine. So the following day, he met with Mr. Kuleba, and this is all about the Ukraine Recovery Conference and preparing for it, which we're going to talk about in 1 second. But in the meantime, then today, he is at the OECD, all about Ukraine. He is there to galvanize global support and help Ukraine's reconstruction as it chairs the annual Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development meeting in Paris today. So we are making sure that Ukraine has as many weapons as we can possibly send it so we can destroy as much of Ukraine as possible. But then we're going to get involved in the reconstruction afterwards if the Russians don't do that first. But anyway, so this is, sorry about that, we'll come on to this. Ukraine Recovery Conference is taking place in a couple of weeks' time, and it's in London, of course. UK jointly with Ukraine will host the Ukraine Recovery Conference, and this is all about, well, what is it about?
It's about money, Mike.
Of course.
This is about money and profit, vast profits, which is why previously we've shown those video clips of the banks. Citibank, I believe, was one of them, getting very excited at the idea of huge investment into Ukraine.
So let's move on to NATO. You got a quick preview of this one, but Operation Balltops has begun, 2023 has begun a couple of days ago. So this is NATO reporting that US 6th Fleet, Naval Striking and Support Forces, NATO kickoff Balltops 2023. So what are we talking about here? This is the premier maritime-focused exercise in the Baltic region, beginning in Tallinn, Estonia. 20 nations, 50 ships, 45 aircraft, 6,000 personnel are participating this year from Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, and the United Kingdom, and the United States, of course. Sweden joins as a partner. Finland joins for the first time as a full member of NATO. But if we just go back 1 year, we've got to remember the claim by Seymour Hersh that has never actually been convincingly denied by anyone in the West, that Balltops 22 was used as the cover for the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. And so my question then, Brian, is what's 2023 going to be used as the cover for?
Well, I hate to think with what we're seeing build at the moment, Mike.
Now, on Monday, we mentioned that Ben Wallace, our fantastic defence secretary, is in the running for the Secretary Generalship of NATO. And Rishi Sunak is heading off to the United States today. And he's going to meet President Biden if he's awake. So meeting with the President of the United States, members of Congress and business leaders, the PM's focus on strengthening the alliance to fuel growth in our economies, create jobs and keep our people safe long into the future. That's what he was tweeting, or Number 10 was tweeting out this morning. But on the grapevine, a very big part of what he's going to be doing in Washington over the next day or two is lobbying for Ben to become Secretary General of NATO, and
so we can ramp the war up even
absolutely
faster,
and UK control of NATO effectively. Now, this is essentially a presidential decision, the Secretary Generalship of NATO, which is why Ben was setting out a stall, as we reported on Monday's program in the Washington Post. And this is a follow-up to that. So, we'll keep you posted on how it goes.
All right. Well, we just end this segment with, this report. Now, I took this from the Ministry of Defence Twitter page. I find this just appalling. It says, Ukrainian military chaplains received 2 weeks of training from British Army chaplains, enhancing their ability to provide pastoral care, spiritual support and moral guidance during military operations. What is so unpleasant about this is that it's the Ukrainians who are arresting clergy in quite brutal ways in Ukraine and destroying the churches in Ukraine, and yet the image being sold by the MOD propaganda team to the British public is that this is all love, light and spirituality. I find this really obscene by the Ministry of Defence, but of course they know no bounds in the area of propaganda as far as Ukraine is concerned. Meanwhile, the West simply, they were ignoring, but maybe it's beginning to hit the press. This is New York Times. Nazi symbols on Ukraine's front lines highlight thorny issues of history. Just very quickly, since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Ukrainian government and NATO allies have posted, then quietly deleted 3 seemingly innocuous photographs from their social media feeds: a soldier standing in a group, another resting in a trench, and an emergency worker posing in front of a truck. In each photograph, the Ukrainians in uniform wore patches featuring symbols that were made notorious by Nazi Germany and have since become part of the iconography of far-right hate groups. The photographs and their deletions highlight the Ukrainian military's it's a complicated relationship, Mike, with Nazi imagery, a relationship forged under both Soviet and German occupation during World War II. Ukraine has worked for years through legislation and military restructuring to contain a fringe far-right movement whose members proudly wear symbols steeped in Nazi history and espouse views hostile to leftists, LGBTQ movements and ethnic minorities. But some members of these groups have been fighting Russia since the Kremlin illegally annexed part of the Crimea region in 2014 and are now part of the, quote, broader military structure. Some are regarded as national heroes, even as the far right remains marginalised politically. Well, it's breaking to the surface again, of course, the Nazi component of the Ukrainian armed forces, but to suggest that politically it's been dealt with is nonsense, because, of course, the Ukraine as a country at the moment is being run by what is essentially a military government. So interesting to see the New York Times starting to get a bit uppity about this, and I predict that further reports are going to come. But we just end on this. While Ukraine is taking place in the way it is, Sky News here reporting that RAF recruiters were against selecting, quote, useless white male pilots so that they could hit diversity targets. Well worth reading this article. So, of course, we've got a Conservative Party where democracy inside the party has been destroyed, so it's operating as a cabal. We've got British Conservative politicians ramping up the war against Russia while they're destroying our armed forces at home. Again, just vicious hypocrisy, Mike, and obviously the public need to understand more of this plan.
Okay, let's move on. If you like what the UK Column does, you would like to support us, please head over to community.ukcolumn.org. There are options to help us out there. You can pick something up at the UK Column shop, but please do share anything you find on the various platforms, especially ukcolumn.org and ukcolumnextracts.co.uk.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, we just give people a reminder that the interview that I did with Sandy Evans a couple of days ago, Adams?
Yes,
Sandy Adams,
yeah.
Sorry, is available on UK Column website. Do have a look at that because it was a very interesting interview. We covered a lot of topics. It was very enjoyable. Mariana Spring got a mention. So if you haven't actually seen that interview, go and have a look.
We've got an advertisement for a 15-minute city event happening in Swindon, Regent Street, Saturday the 10th of June, this coming Saturday, 12:30 p.m. Piers Corbyn, Debbie Hicks, Paul Burgess, Andy Osborne, Catherine Armitage, Jasmine speaking, more speakers to be confirmed. It's all about leafleting and public conversation and so on. So do get along to that if you're in the area.
And of course, one of the things Sandy was talking about is how people are stepping forward now to challenge local councils, in particular town councils, to inform them about the 15-minute cities and to get people active in saying, no, we don't want this. Now, we've got an advert for an interview, which is going to be tomorrow at 1 o'clock. This is David Scott with John Waters. Title is The Root of All Evil. John Waters has been doing a lot of really good work there in Ireland, exposing what's been happening in the globalist agenda. And I'm sure this is going to be a very good interview to watch as well.
Okay, thank you to everybody that wrote, and quite a lot of you did, about the digital pound consultation, the central bank digital currency consultation, which I incorrectly said on Monday's programme ended today, in fact. So let's just bring up what the Bank of England has said on this. On the 1st of June, the original deadline of the 7th of June was extended due to the omission of the following question from the online response form. And the question is, do you have comments on a proposal that non-UK residents should have access to the digital pound on the same basis as